and welcome to the Firm Foundation series. My name is Dale Yancey. Today we're on lesson 30, The Rise of David the Shepherd Boy. If you're like me and you're watching a movie or you're reading a book where there are two opponents, do you usually find yourself rooting for the underdog? I know I do. And the underdog is usually the guy who's not as big, not as strong. He doesn't have all the resources that his opponent has, but somehow you want him to come out on top. You find yourself cheering for him to win, to get the victory. And maybe that's why America has a love affair with the Rocky series. I mean, we're always rooting for Rocky Balboa to win every single fight, whether he's fighting a big bad Russian by the name of Ivan or someone by the name of Apollo Creed. We want Rocky to come out on top. We want him to win. And in today's lesson, we're talking about one of the greatest underdog stories that's ever been written. And this is not just some tale of fiction, folks. This actually happened. Of course, I'm talking about David and Goliath, one of the most famous stories in the Bible, one of the most famous stories in all the world. Well, this is a familiar story of a kid who goes up against this 9-foot, 9-inch giant. And all that this kid has for a weapon is a slingshot. And you may have some preconceived ideas as a result of hearing this story referred to numerous times, but maybe never really having stopped to carefully look at what's going on. So let's try to get a fresh look at the story of David and Goliath as well as David's rise to power in today's lesson. And also, I just want to remind you that you can go to our website. The address is right here on the screen, foundationstudy.weebly.com. That's foundationstudy.weebly.com. We got all the videos here, starting with lesson number 1, going right up to the present, so you can view all the video teachings and also download notes for every single lesson. So check out our website, foundationstudy.weebly.com. All right, let's do some questions for review from last week, where we were on lesson 29, God gives Israel a king. And question number 1, why did the people want a king? Because they were tired of being special. They wanted to be like everyone else, like all the nations around them. They wanted a king that they could see. So why was Saul chosen? Because he's tall and good looking. 3, did the people reject God as the king? Yes. 4, was Saul a good choice as a king? Why or why not? No. Saul cared more about how he looked in the eyes of man than in the eyes of God. Saul had a half-hearted obedience to God. In many ways, Saul was religious and wanted to look good outwardly, but God did not possess his heart. Question 5. What were some of the things that Samuel told the people would change if they had a king? Well, Samuel told them that their king would force all their young men to be in his army. He would force some of them to do his plowing and harvesting, as well as make his weapons for war and build his chariots. Their king would take their daughters to make perfume and to do all his household chores like cooking and baking. Their king would take the best fields, olive groves, and vineyards in Israel and give them to his servants. Their king would take 1/10 of what they had produced to give to his servants. And finally, their new king would take the Israelites' male and female servants, along with the strongest and finest young men, to do his work, and he'd take their donkeys as well. 6. How does God measure a man or a woman? By their looks or what? No, God looks upon the heart. 7. Is God ever late? No. 8. Why was Samuel angry with Saul for not waiting and for going ahead and offering the burnt offering and sacrifice by himself? Well, it's because that was the responsibility of the priest. Saul had not been anointed as a priest, and he was showing his disobedience, his impatience, and his lack of trust in Samuel, who is God's anointed priest and judge. 9. When Israel attacks the Amalekites and they're victorious, what are the 3 lies that Saul tells to Samuel? Well, Saul says, I've done all that the Lord has commanded. B, Saul claims that his soldiers took the livestock. And C, that the animals are for a sacrifice. 10. 1 Samuel 15:22. Does the Lord delight in burnt offerings and sacrifice as much as what? What are the missing words? As much as in obeying the voice of the Lord. Does the Lord delight in burnt offerings and sacrifice as much as obeying the voice of the Lord? Finally, 11. What are the 3 things we learn about Saul's disobedience to the Lord's command? Well, it was a partial obedience. Saul did most of what God commanded, but not all. B, Saul camouflages his disobedience as being religious. He saved the livestock to offer a sacrifice to God. He spared the best of the livestock to offer his people a free meal at his expense and to look good and benevolent in their eyes. And C, he doesn't take his disobedience seriously. After confessing his sin, he wants to move on and receive the blessing of God, sidestepping the issue of discipline. A, David the shepherd boy. Well, after the prophet Samuel realizes that Saul and his descendants will no longer continue to rule Israel, he goes looking for another candidate. And guided by God, Samuel finds himself in the little town of Bethlehem, knocking on the door of a man named Jesse, among whose sons the next king of Israel is to be found. Well, Jesse presents 7 of his sons, and Samuel sees that these are amazing young men. They're physically fit, they're well educated in Jewish law, they're dedicated to God. But that's not good enough. The Bible tells us that as Samuel is admiring one of Jesse's sons, he gets a message or a word from God. And let's read in 1 Samuel 16:7. But the Lord said to Samuel, "Don't judge by his appearance or height, for I have rejected him." The Lord doesn't see things the way you see them. People judge by outward appearance, but the Lord looks at the heart. So Samuel asks Jesse, "Don't you have any more sons?" And Jesse's a little flustered, and he responds, "Well, yeah, there's still the youngest one. He's like the runt of the litter, but he's out tending the sheep." Well, let's read from 1 Samuel 16:10 and see what happens next. In the same way, all 7 of Jesse's sons were presented to Samuel. But Samuel said to Jesse, "The Lord has not chosen any of these." Then Samuel asked, "Are these all the sons you have?" "Well, they're still the youngest," Jesse replied, "but he's out in the field watching the sheep and goats." "Send for him at once," Samuel said. "We're not going to sit down to eat until he arrives." So Jesse sent for him. He was dark and handsome with beautiful eyes, and the Lord said, "This is the one, anoint him." So as David stood there among his brothers, Samuel took the flask of olive oil he had brought and anointed David with the oil, and the Spirit of the Lord came powerfully upon David from that day on. Then Samuel returned to Ramah. Well, the little one, the runt of the litter, is David, and Samuel demands that Jesse go get him. And as soon as little David appears, Samuel knows that he's the one. And despite the fact that he's physically not all that impressive, he has what it takes to be the leader that Israel needs as their king. And this teaches us a really important lesson about how we're supposed to judge people. You see, we live in such a superficial world. We're judged by how we look, which is why plastic surgery and Botox treatments are so popular, such a big deal. Men and women spend hours in the gym trying to attain that so-called perfect body. But you see, Judaism teaches that true greatness of an individual is not measured by outward appearance. True greatness resides in the soul. See, God doesn't measure us on how we look on the outside. He's concerned with our hearts and with our soul. And so to put it another way, He's concerned with our inner man. Some people spend all their time building up themselves on the outside or doing Botox treatments on their face and all that, when their inner man is languishing and looks like a skeleton because it's not been nurtured in any way whatsoever. Well, David was gifted with musical talent, which would elevate him to the spotlight. And David became well known for his ability to play the lyre, which is like a small harp. The Bible says that because of Saul's wrongdoings, God sent an evil spirit to torment him. So Saul seeks a musician to calm his nerves. Ironically, the musician that's called to assist him turns out to be David, the little boy who would one day be the king. And now we come to B, slaying Goliath. And the theme here is that God is all-powerful and that man must have faith in order to please God and to be saved. Well, the Israelites are in yet another battle with the Philistines. Only this time there's no fighting going on. And the reason is because the Israelites are afraid, because the Philistines have challenged them as far as the terms of engagement. The Philistines offer to become Israel's slaves if they can defeat their champion in a one-on-one combat. The only problem is that their champion, whose name is Goliath, this guy is huge. According to the account in the Bible, he's 9 feet 9 inches tall, making him even taller than the tallest NBA superstar. Well, Goliath taunts Israel every day. He's bad-mouthing and trash-talking not only Israel, but also God. Desperate, Saul offers to anyone who might kill Goliath his daughter in marriage, wealth, and even an exemption from paying taxes. And even with a tax break, no one accepts the challenge, and Goliath taunts Israel in this regard for 40 days. Meanwhile, back in Bethlehem, Jesse summons David from looking after the flocks of sheep, and he wants David to go and check on the welfare of his brothers, who are serving the Israelites in the army. Well, when he arrives at the Israelite camp and he hears Goliath's taunts and trash talk, he's outraged that no one has had enough confidence in God to stand up to this uncircumcised Philistine. And here's what David does. So David left the sheep with another shepherd. He set out early the next morning with the gifts as Jesse had directed him. He arrives at the camp just as the Israelite army was leaving for the battlefield with shouts and battle cries. Soon the Israelite and Philistine forces stood facing each other, army against army. David left his things with the keeper of supplies, and he hurried out to the ranks to greet his brothers. And as he is talking with them, Goliath, the Philistine champion from Gath, came out from the Philistine ranks. Then David heard him shout his usual taunt to the army of Israel. As soon as the Israelite army saw him, they began to run in fright. "Have you seen the giant?" the men asked. "He comes out each day to defy Israel. The king has offered a huge reward to anyone who kills him. He'll give the man one of his daughters for a wife, and the man's entire family will be exempted from paying taxes." Well, David asked the soldiers standing nearby, "What will a man get for killing this Philistine and ending his defiance of Israel? Who is this pagan Philistine anyway, that he's allowed to defy the armies of the living God?" And these men gave David the same reply. They said, "Yes, that's the reward for killing him." But when David's oldest brother Eliab heard David talking to the men, he was angry. "What are you doing around here?" he demanded. "Why aren't you out there with those sheep that you're supposed to be taking care of? I know your pride and deceit. You just want to see the battle." "What have I done now?" David replied. "I was only asking a question." He walks over to some others and he asks them the same thing, and he received the same answer. Then David's question was reported to King Saul, and King Saul sent for him. Well, David asked Saul to let him take on Goliath's challenge. And admiring David's courage, Saul agrees, and he gives David his royal armor. Well, Saul's battle duds are way too big for young David, so he decides just to throw him off and to face Goliath without any armor. But David doesn't go out there without a weapon. Let's read in 1 Samuel 17, verse 32. "And David said to Saul, 'Let no man's heart fail because of him. Your servant will go and fight with this Philistine.' And Saul said to David, 'You're not able to go against this Philistine and fight with him, for you are but a youth, and he's been a man of war from his youth.' But David said to Saul, 'Your servant used to keep sheep for his father. And when there came a lion or a bear and took a lamb from the flock, I went after him and struck him and delivered him out of its mouth. And if he arose against me, I caught him by his beard and struck him and killed him. Your servant has struck down both lions and bears, and this uncircumcised Philistine shall be like one of them, for he has defied the armies of the living God.' And David said, 'The Lord who delivered me from the paw of the lion and from the paw of the bear will deliver me from the hand of this Philistine.' And Saul said to David, 'Go, and the Lord be with you.' And then Saul gathered David with his armor. He put a helmet of bronze on his head. He clothed him with his coat of armor. And David strapped his sword over his armor. He tried in vain to go, but he couldn't get anywhere. He was weighted down. Then David said to Saul, 'I can't go with these, for I have not tested them.' So Saul put them off. And then he took his staff in his hand, and he chose 5 smooth stones from the brook, and he put them in his shepherd's pouch. And his slingshot was in his hand as he approached the Philistine. And the Philistine moved forward, and he came near to David, with his shield bearer in front of him. And when the Philistine looked and saw David, he disdained him, for he was but a youth, ruddy and handsome in appearance. And the Philistine said to David, 'Am I a dog, that you come to me with sticks?' And the Philistine cursed David by his gods. The Philistine said to David, 'Come to me, and I will give your flesh to the birds of the air and to the beasts of the field.' And then David said to the Philistine, 'You come to me with a sword and with a spear and with a javelin, but I come to you in the name of the Lord of hosts, the God of the armies of Israel, whom you have defied. This day the Lord will deliver you into my hand, and I will strike you down and cut off your head, and I will give the dead bodies of the host of the Philistines this day to the birds of the air and to the wild beasts of the earth, that all the earth may know that there is a God in Israel. And that all this assembly may know that the Lord saves, not with a sword and spear, for the battle is the Lord's, and he will give you into our hand.' When the Philistine arose and came and drew near to meet David, David ran quickly toward the battle line to meet the Philistine. And David put his hand in his bag. He took out a stone, and he slung it, and he struck the Philistine on his forehead. The stone sank into his forehead, and he fell on his face to the ground. So David prevailed over the Philistine with a slingshot and with a stone, and he struck the Philistine and killed him. There was no sword in the hand of David. Then David ran over and stood over the Philistine. He took Goliath's sword, he drew it out of its sheath, and he killed him and cut off his head with it. And when the Philistines saw that their champion was dead, they fled." And the key verse here is 1 Samuel 17:45. Then David said to the Philistine, "You come to meet me with a sword, spear, and javelin, but I come to you in the name of the Lord of hosts, the God of the armies of Israel, whom you have taunted." Well, David certainly wins the battle of words, but the battle of brawn has yet to take place. Running toward Goliath, David puts a stone in a slingshot, and after achieving the desired velocity, he lets it fly, hitting Goliath squarely in the forehead. Goliath falls, and while the giant is still unconscious, lying there on the ground, David rushes over to him, and he takes his gigantic sword and cuts off his head. David takes Goliath's head and the armor as war trophies, and eventually he deposits the sword at the tabernacle as a testimony to God's role in giving him the victory. And now we come to C, man on the run. Well, after David defeats Goliath, the Israelite women go around the streets singing, "Saul has slain his thousands and David his 10,000s. And Saul becomes jealous of David because David's now in the spotlight. And Saul doesn't like to share the spotlight with anyone. So one day while David's playing his lyre, Saul picks up a spear and he throws it at David, but he misses his target. Saul then comes up with more cunning ideas and plans on how to kill his rival. And the theme here is that God is faithful and he never changes. Saul continues his attempts to kill David, but the combination of David's agility and with the help of others, even Saul's own children, Michal and Jonathan, David always escapes. In one incident, Saul falls for the oldest trick in the book. Michal puts a pillow and clothes under the blankets and says that David is sick in bed while David escapes out the back. In another incident, Saul goes into a cave to relieve himself. And let's read what happens here in 1 Samuel 24. Then Saul took 3,000 chosen men from all Israel and went to seek David and his men in front of the rocks of the wild goats. He came to the sheepfolds on the way, where there was a cave, and Saul went in to relieve himself. Now David and his men were sitting in the inner recesses of the cave. The men of David said, "Behold, this is the day which the Lord said to you, Behold, I am about to give your enemy into your hand, and you shall do to him as it seems good to you." And then David arose, and he cut off the edge of Saul's robe secretly. And it came about afterward that David's conscience bothered him, because he had cut off the edge of Saul's robe. So he said to his men, "Far be it from me because of the Lord that I should do this thing to my Lord, the Lord's anointed, to stretch out my hand against him, since he is the Lord's anointed." David persuaded his men with these words, and he did not allow them to rise up against Saul. And Saul arose and left the cave and went on his way. So here's what's going on. David and his men are already in the cave, there in the dark, way in the far recesses of the cave. And Saul goes in to relieve himself in the dark. And unbeknownst to Saul, David cuts off a corner of his robe while Saul's taking a nap. Now David has a chance to kill Saul, but he refuses to do such a thing to God's anointed. You see, even though Saul is trying to kill him, David recognizes that God's anointing is still on King Saul. And now we come to D, the adventures of David and his merry men. Well, because of David's status as an outlaw, he's forced to rob from the rich and give to the poor. The poor in this case being David and his followers. And the most famous case of David's Robin Hood antics involves a rich man named Nabal, who refuses to pay David for protecting his flocks. It's kind of like an ancient protection racket that David had going on. Let's read 1 Samuel 25, verse 10. "Who is this fellow David?" Nabal sneered to the young men. "Who does this son of Jesse think he is? There are lots of servants these days who run away from their masters. Should I take my bread and my water and my meat that I've slaughtered for my shears and give it to a band of outlaws who come from who knows where?" So David's young men returned and told him what Nabal had said. "Get your swords," was David's reply as he strapped on his own. And then 400 men started off with David, and 200 remained behind to guard their equipment. Meanwhile, one of Nabal's servants went to Abigail and told her, "David sent messengers from the wilderness to greet our master, but he screamed insults at them. These men have been very good to us. We've never suffered any harm from them, and nothing has been stolen from us the whole time that they were with us. In fact, day and night they were like a wall of protection to us and the sheep. You need to know this and figure out what to do, for there's going to be trouble for our master and his whole family. He's so ill-tempered that no one can even talk to him." Well, Abigail wasted no time. She quickly gathered 200 loaves of bread, 2 wineskins full of wine, 5 sheep that had been slaughtered, nearly a bushel of roasted grain, 100 clusters of raisins, and 200 fig cakes, and she packed them on the donkeys. And she said to her servants, "Go on ahead. I'll follow you shortly." But she didn't tell her husband Nabal what she was doing. And she was riding her donkey into a mountain ravine when she saw David and his men coming toward her. David had just been saying, "A lot of good it did to help this fellow," We protected his flocks in the wilderness, and nothing he owned was lost or stolen, but he has repaid me evil for good. May God strike me and kill me if even one man of his household is still left alive tomorrow morning." Well, when Abigail saw David, she quickly got off her donkey. She bowed low before him, and she fell at his feet and said, "I accept all blame in this matter, my lord. Please listen to what I have to say. I know that Nabal is wicked and he's an ill-tempered man. Please don't pay any attention to him. He's a fool, just like his name. But I never even saw the young men you sent. Now, my lord, as surely as the Lord lives and you yourself live, since the Lord has kept you from murdering and taking vengeance into your own hands, let all your enemies and those who try to harm you be as cursed as Nabal is. And here's a present that I, your servant, have brought to you and your young men. Please forgive me if I have offended you in any way. The Lord will surely reward you with a lasting dynasty, for you are fighting the Lord's battles, and you have not done wrong throughout your entire life. Even when you are chased by those who seek to kill you, your life is safe in the care of the Lord your God, secure in his treasure pouch. But the lives of your enemies will disappear like stones shot from a sling. When the Lord has done all that he has promised and has made you leader of Israel, don't let this be a blemish on your record. Then your conscience won't have to bear the staggering burden of needless bloodshed and vengeance. And when the Lord has done these great things for you, please remember me, your servant." Well, David replied to Abigail, "Praise the Lord, the God of Israel, who has sent you to meet me today. Thank God for your good sense. Bless you from keeping me from murder and from carrying out vengeance with my own hands. For I swear by the Lord, the God of Israel, who has kept me from hurting you, that if you had not hurried out to meet me, not one of Nabal's men would still be alive tomorrow morning." And then David accepted her present, and he told her, "Return home in peace. I have heard what you said, and we will not kill your husband." When Abigail arrived home, she found Nabal was throwing a big party and was celebrating like a king. He was very, very drunk, so she didn't even tell him about her meeting with David until dawn the next day. In the morning, when Nabal was sober, his wife told him what had happened, and as a result he had a stroke. He lay paralyzed on his bed like a stone, and 10 days later the Lord struck him and he died. So when Nabal's wife Abigail hears of her husband's foolish response to David's request, she intercepts David. She flatters him and she presents lots of gifts to him, and she tells him that her husband's just like his name. He's a fool. And David is persuaded by Abigail's words, and he returns to his camp. And when Abigail arrives home, she puts off telling her drunken husband about his near-death experience until the wine has left him. That's a euphemism for urination. When she does tell him, he has a seizure and he dies. Thus David's words that those who urinate against the wall will die, it comes true in an unexpected way. And Abigail is now available, so David marries her. But the marriage doesn't settle David down. He remains on the run for some time, even living for a year and 4 months with Israel's enemy, the Philistines. David had little choice in the matter. This is one of the few places where he can go and be safe from all of Saul's murderous intentions. So David and his men even go on several raiding parties into Israel. However, the Bible is careful to point out that David actually tricked the Philistines in this regard, because instead of attacking Israel, David and his men go elsewhere, and then they bring back war spoils that they claim are from Israel. But when the Philistines began making war preparations for a massive attack against Israel, David finds himself in somewhat of a bind. He's between a rock and a hard place because he doesn't want to attack his own people. Well, thankfully, there are some kings in Philistine who don't trust David. They refuse to let him participate in the battle against Israel, lest he change sides in the midst of the battle. And now we come to E, how the mighty have fallen, the deaths of Samuel, Saul, and Jonathan. And the theme here is that God is supreme and sovereign. Well, Samuel eventually dies, and the whole country mourns his passing. And adding to their grief, a huge battle against the Philistines looms on the horizon. And without Samuel, Saul is unable to determine whether God intends to give the Israelites victory. So Saul realizes that there's only one way to get an answer. He needs to ask his old buddy Samuel. But you're thinking, wait a minute, you just said that Samuel was dead. True, Samuel is dead. You see, because in the ancient world as well as today, there are those who claim to be able to contact the dead. We call them mediums or psychics, calling up the 1-800-PSYCHIC hotline. But the real problem in Saul's case is that he outlawed the contacting of the dead some years earlier. Saul doesn't want to be seen going against his own law. Therefore, he disguises himself and he secretly visits a medium at the city of Endor. Now, the witch of Endor, as she's sometimes called, she summons Samuel. But when she sees him, she realizes that the man who's making this request is none other than King Saul, and she fears for her life. Saul assures her that he won't kill her, and he asks her to tell him what she sees. And she says, "It's Samuel. I see Samuel. And he has a question for you, Saul." And Samuel says, "Why have you disturbed me?" When Samuel hears the reason that Saul wants to know who the winner will be of the upcoming Israelite-Philistine battle, he reminds Saul that God has rejected him as king and concludes, "Tomorrow you and your sons will be with me." Needless to say, that's not the good news that Saul was looking for. And the next day, in keeping with Samuel's predictions, the Israelites are routed by the Philistines, and many of Saul's sons, including David's best friend Jonathan, the crown prince, dies in battle. And Saul himself is mortally wounded in battle, and he asks his armor-bearer to finish the job so that the Philistines won't capture and torture him. The armor-bearer refuses to kill God's anointed king, and Saul is forced to take matters into his own hands. He falls upon his own sword, and when the Philistines arrive, they cut off Saul's head, and they take it, along with his armor, to the temple of their God. Thus, when we come to the end of 1 Samuel, Israelites at a critical juncture in their national history. Their last judge Samuel is dead, as well as their first king and most of his sons. And what happens next is going to be crucial for the survival of Israel as a nation. And we'll look at that in our next lesson, in lesson 31, David, the shepherd king of Israel. But let's review today's lesson, just to make sure you have a good understanding of what we've been talking about today. Question number 1. Samuel goes to Jesse's house in Bethlehem to look for the next king. What is the message that God gives to Samuel as he's looking at Jesse's sons? 1 Samuel 16:7. But the Lord said to Samuel, "Don't judge by his appearance or height, for I have rejected him. The Lord doesn't see things the way you see them. People judge by outward appearance, but the Lord looks at the heart." 2. How was David armed when he faced Goliath? He only had his shepherd's staff and a slingshot and 5 smooth stones. 3. Whose name did David say had authorized him to fight Goliath and win? 1 Samuel 17:45, David says, "I come to you in the name of the Lord of hosts, the God of the armies of Israel, whom you have defied." 4. After David kills Goliath, what event causes King Saul to become jealous of David? Well, the Israelite women go around the streets singing, "Saul has slain his thousands, and David his 10,000s." 5. When David comes upon Saul in the cave, what does he do? He cuts off the edge of Saul's robe while he's asleep. 6. Why doesn't David follow the advice of his men and kill King Saul, who is asleep in the cave? Well, it's because David knows that King Saul is still God's anointed king and refuses to touch God's anointed. 7. How does Nabal treat David and his men after they're offered protection for him, his household, and his sheep? He treats David and his men with contempt. He mocks David and his men as outlaws. 8. Who intervenes on Nabal's behalf? His wife Abigail, who intercedes on behalf of her husband, whom she says is a fool. And 9. What happens to Nabal? He suffers a stroke, he's paralyzed, and he dies 10 days later. 10. What becomes of Nabal's wife Abigail? She marries David. 11. Samuel is the last what of Israel? Judge. And 12. When Samuel dies, how does Saul try to communicate with him? By consulting the witch at Endor. 13. What message does Samuel give to Saul from beyond the grave? The next day, Saul and his sons will be killed by the Philistines. Well, that's it for today's lesson. I'll be with you again next time. And until then, this is Pastor Joe saying, may the blessing and peace of God be upon you and your family. Shalom. 4, 3